There have been a variety of Christian views on poverty and wealth. American theologian John B.Cobb has argued that the economism that rules the West and through it much of the East is directly opposed to traditional Christian doctrine. Cobb invokes the teaching of Jesus that man cannot serve both God and Mammon. He asserts that it is obvious that Western society is organized in the service of wealth, and thus wealth has triumphed over God in the West. Scottish theologian Jack Mahoney has characterized the saying of Jesus in Mark chapter 10 verses 23 to 27 as having imprinted themselves so deeply on the Christian community through the centuries that those who are well off, or even comfortably off, often feel uneasy and troubled in conscience. At one end of the spectrum is a view which casts wealth and materialism as an evil to be avoided and even combated. At the other end is a view which casts prosperity and well-being as a blessing from God. Some Christians argue that a proper understanding of Christian teachings on wealth and poverty needs to take a larger view where the accumulation of wealth is not the central focus of one's life but rather a resource to foster the good life. Professor David W. Miller has constructed a three-part rubric which presents three prevalent attitudes among Protestants towards wealth. According to this rubric, Protestants have variously viewed wealth as an offense to the Christian faith, an obstacle to faith, and the outcome of faith. Wealth and faith. Wealth as an offense to faith. According to historian Alan S. Kahan, there is a strand of Christianity that views the wealthy man as especially sinful. In this strand of Christianity, Kahan asserts the day of judgment is viewed as a time when the social order will be turned upside down and the poor will turn out to be the ones truly blessed. Thomas Aquinas wrote, "Greed is a sin against God, just as all mortal sins, inasmuch as man condemns things eternal for the sake of temporal things." David Miller suggests that this view is similar to that of the 3rd century Manichaeans who saw the spiritual world as being good and the material world as evil, with the two being in irreconcilable conflict with each other. Thus, this strand of Christianity exhorts Christians to renounce material and worldly pleasures in order to follow Jesus. As an example, Miller cites Jesus' injunction to his disciples to take nothing for the journey. The Catholic worker movement advocate voluntary poverty. Christians, such as new monastics, may choose to reject personal wealth and follow an ascetic lifestyle, in part as a protest against a church and public that embraces wealth, luxury and ostentatious power. Wealth as an obstacle to faith. According to David Miller, Martin Luther viewed mammon as the most common idol on earth. Miller cites Jesus' encounter with the rich ruler in Mark chapter 10 verses 17 to 31 as an example of wealth being an obstacle to faith. According to Miller, it is not the rich man's wealth per se that is the obstacle but rather the man's reluctance to give up that wealth in order to follow Jesus. Miller cites Paul's observation in 1 Timothy that people who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 9. Paul continues on with the observation that the love of money is the root of all evil. 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 10. Miller emphasizes that it is the love of money that is the obstacle to faith, not the money itself. Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, "How hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God." The disciples were amazed at his words. But Jesus said again, "Children, how hard it is to enter the kingdom of God." 25. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. The disciples were even more amazed, and said to each other, "Who then can be saved?" Jesus looked at them and said, "With man this is impossible, but not with God. All things are possible with God." Cohan cites Jesus' injunction against amassing material wealth as an example that the good life was one of poverty and charity, storing up treasures in heaven instead of earth. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Matthew chapter 6. Jesus counsels his followers to remove from their lives those things which cause them to sin, saying, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than to go with two hands into hell, where the fire never goes out. Mark chapter 9 verses 42 to 49. In order to remove the desire for wealth and material possessions as an obstacle to faith, some Christians have taken vows of poverty. Christianity has a long tradition of voluntary poverty which is manifested in the form of asceticism, charity, and almsgiving. Cohan argues that Christianity is unique because it sparked the beginning of a phenomenon which he calls the Great Renunciation, in which millions of people would renounce sex and money in God's name. In Roman Catholicism, poverty is one of the evangelical counsels. Pope Benedict XVI distinguishes poverty chosen and poverty to be fought. He considers that the moderation implied in the former favors solidarity, and is a necessary condition so as to fight effectively to eradicate the abuse of the latter. Certain religious institutes also take a vow of extreme poverty. For example, the Franciscan orders have traditionally foregone all individual and corporate forms of ownership. Wealth as an outcome of faith. One line of Protestant thinking views the pursuit of wealth as not only acceptable but as a religious calling, a duty. This perspective is generally ascribed to Calvinist and Puritan theologies, which view hard work and frugal lifestyles as spiritual acts in themselves. John Wesley was a strong proponent of wealth creation. However, to avoid wealth becoming an obstacle to faith, Wesley exhorted his audiences to earn all they can, save all they can, and give away all they can. Included among those who view wealth as an outcome of faith are modern-day preachers and authors who propound prosperity theology, teaching that God promises wealth and abundance to those who will believe in Him and follow His laws. Prosperity theology is a Christian religious belief whose proponents claim the Bible teaches that financial blessing is the will of God for Christians. Most teachers of prosperity theology maintain that a combination of faith, positive speech, and donations to Christian ministries will always cause an increase in material wealth for those who practice these actions. Prosperity theology is almost always taught in conjunction with continuationism. Prosperity theology first came to prominence in the United States during the healing revivals in the 1950s. Some commentators have linked the genesis of prosperity theology with the influence of the New Thought movement. It later figured prominently in the Word of Faith movement and 1980s televangelism. In the 1990s and 2000s, it became accepted by many influential leaders in the charismatic movement and has been promoted by Christian missionaries throughout the world. It has been harshly criticized by leaders of mainstream evangelicalism as a non-scriptural doctrine or as an outright heresy. Precursors to Christianity. Professor Cosimo Perotta describes the early Christian period as one which saw the meeting and clash of three great cultures: the classical, the Hebrew, and the Christian. Perotta describes the cultures as having radically different views of money and wealth. Whereas the Hebrew culture prized material wealth, the classical and Christian cultures either held them in contempt or preached indifference to them. However, Perotta points out that the motivation of the classical and Christian cultures for their attitudes were very different, and thus the logical implications of the attitudes resulted in different outcomes. comes. Jewish attitudes in the Old Testament. Perotta characterizes the attitude of the Jews as expressed in the Old Testament scriptures as being completely different from the classical view. Quote, he points out that servile and hired work was not scorned by the Jews of the Old Testament as it was by Greco-Roman thinkers. Instead, such work was protected by biblical commandments to pay workers on time and not to cheat them. The poor were protected from being exploited when in debt. Perotta asserts that the goal of these commandments was not only to protect the poor but also to prevent the excessive accumulation of wealth in a few hands. In essence, the poor man is protected by God. However, Perotta points out that poverty is not admitted nor is it considered a positive value by the writers of the Old Testament. The poor are protected because the weak should be protected from exploitation. Perotta points out that material wealth is highly valued in the Old Testament. The Hebrews seek it and God promises to bless them with it if they will follow His commandments. Joseph Francis Kelly writes that biblical writers leave no doubt that God enabled men such as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and Solomon to achieve wealth and that this wealth was a sign of divine favor. However, Kelly also points out that the Old Testament insisted that the rich aid the poor. Prophets such as Amos castigated the rich for oppressing the poor and crushing the needy. In summary, Kelly writes that the Old Testament saw wealth as something good but warned the wealthy not to use the position to harm those with less. The rich had an obligation to alleviate the sufferings of the poor. New Testament. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. The Gospels. Jesus explicitly condemns wealth as an intrinsic evil in various passages in the Gospels, especially in Luke. He also consistently warns of the danger of riches as a hindrance to favor with God, as in the parable of the sower, where it is said, "And the cares of this world, and the deceitfulness of riches, and the lusts of other things entering in, it chokes the word, which becomes unfruitful." Mark chapter 4 verse 19. Jesus makes mammon a personification of riches, one in opposition to God, and which claims a person's service and loyalty as God does. But Jesus rejects the possibility of dual service on our part, for, he says, no one can serve both God and mammon. In the story of Jesus and the rich young man, the young ruler's wealth inhibits him from following Jesus and thereby attaining the kingdom. Jesus comments on the young man's discouragement thus, how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. Indeed, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. Quote, those who heard this were astonished. Who then can be saved? They asked. Jesus replied, what is impossible with man is possible with God. Luke chapter 19 verses 23 to 27. In the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus exhorts his hearers to sell their earthly goods and give to the poor, and to provide themselves with a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. And he adds, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. In the parable of the rich fool, Jesus tells the story of a rich man who decides to rest from all his labors, saying to himself, and I will say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink and be merry. But God spoke to him, saying, you fool, this very night your life will be required of you. Then who will get all that you have prepared for yourself? Luke chapter 12 verse 16 to 20. And Jesus adds, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich toward God. Jesus and Zacchaeus is an example of storing up heavenly treasure and being rich toward God. The repentant tax collector Zacchaeus not only welcomes Jesus into his house but joyfully promises to give half of his possessions to the poor, and to rebate overpayments 4 times over if he defrauded anyone. Luke strongly strongly ties the right use of riches to discipleship, and securing heavenly treasure is linked with caring for the poor, the naked and the hungry, for God is supposed to have a special interest in the poor. This theme is consistent with God's protection and care of the poor in the Old Testament. Thus, Jesus cites the words of the prophet Isaiah in proclaiming his mission. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." Luke chapter 4 verses 18 to 19. Luke, as is well known, had a particular concern for the poor as the subjects of Jesus' compassion and ministry. In his version of the Beatitudes, the poor are blessed as the inheritors of God's kingdom, even as the corresponding curses are pronounced to the rich. God's special interest in the poor is also expressed in the theme of the eschatological great reversal of fortunes between the rich and the poor. In the Magnificat, he has shown the might of his arm, and has scattered the proud. In the conceit of the hearts, he has pulled down the mighty from the thrones, and exalted the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich has sent empty away. Luke chapter 1 verses 51 to 53. And in Jesus' repeated use of the tag, "Many that are first shall be last, and the last shall be first," and similar figures. In the parable of the wedding feast, it is the poor, the crippled, the blind and the lame, who become God's honored guests, while others reject the invitation because of their earthly cares and possessions. Acts of the Apostles. Luke's concern for the rich and the poor continues in the Acts with a greater focus on the unity of the nascent Christian communities. The two famous passages, which have been appealed to throughout history as the normative ideal of the community of goods for Christians, rather describe the extent of fellowship in Jerusalem community as a part of distinctive Christian identity. Acts also portrays both positive and negative uses of wealth. Those who practiced almsgiving and generosity to the poor, and those who gave priority to money over the needs of others. Epistles. For Paul, riches mainly denotes the character and activity of God and Christ, spiritual blessings, and of salvation, although he occasionally refers to typical Jewish piety and Greco-Roman moral teachings of the time, such as generosity and hospitality, with warnings against pride and greed. 1 Tim. 6.10 seems to reflect a popular cynic Stoic moral teaching of the period. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Paul's focus of generosity is devoted to the collection for the church in Jerusalem as an important symbol of unity between Jewish and Gentile believers, with an appeal to material and spiritual reciprocity. A concept related to the accumulation of wealth is worldliness, which is denounced by the epistles of James and John. Don't you know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. The first letter of John says, in a similar vein, do not love the world of the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. The Epistle of James also stands out for its vehement condemnation of the oppressive rich, who were presumably outsiders to the Christian community, which mainly consisted of the poor, adopting the Psalter's convention of the wicked rich and the pious poor, and adopting its voice. James indicts the rich with the sins of hoarding wealth, fraudulently withholding wages, corruption, pride, luxury, covetousness and murder, and denounces the folly of their actions in the face of the imminent day of judgment. Revelation. Finally, the Revelation treats earthly riches and commercial activities with great ambivalence. While Jesus exposes the true poverty of the Laodicean church's boast of wealth, he presents himself as the true source and dispenser of wealth. Later, earthly riches and businesses activities are associated with the sins of Babylon. The earthly power power of evil with self-accorded glory and luxury, whose fall is imminent. However, the Revelations also portrays the New Jerusalem with a lavish materialistic description, made of pure gold decorated with every kind of precious stone. Early Christianity appears to have adopted many of the ethical themes found in the Hebrew Bible. However, the teachings of Jesus and his apostles as presented in the New Testament exhibit an acute sensitivity to the needs of the disadvantaged that Frederick sees as adding a critical edge to Christian teaching where wealth and the pursuit of economic gain are concerned. Alan Kahan points to the fact that Jesus was a poor man as emblematic of a revolution in the way poverty and wealth were viewed. Quote, "This is not to say that Christian attitudes borrowed nothing from its Greco-Roman and Jewish precursors." Kahan acknowledges that Christian theology absorbed those Greco-Roman attitudes towards money that complemented its own. Quote, "However, as Kahan puts it, never before had any God been conceived of as poor." Quote, he characterizes Christian charity as being different in kind from the generosity praised in the classical tradition. Kahan contrasts the attitudes of early Christians with those of classical thinkers such as Seneca. The New Testament urges Christians to sell material possessions and give the money to the poor. According to Kahan, the goal of Christian charity is equality, a notion which is absent in the Greco-Roman attitudes toward the poor. Cosimo Perotta characterizes the Christian attitude vis-a-vis poverty and work as being much closer to the tradition of the Old Testament than to classical culture. Quote, however, Irving Kristol suggests that Christianity's attitude towards wealth is markedly different from that of the Hebrews in the Old Testament. Kristol asserts that traditional Judaism has no precepts that parallel the Christian assertion that it is difficult for a rich man to get into heaven. Perotta characterizes Christianity as not disdaining material wealth as did classical thinkers such as Socrates, the Cynics and Seneca, and yet not desiring it as the Old Testament writers did. Patristic era. Many of the Church Fathers condemned private property and advocated the communal ownership of property as an ideal for Christians to follow. However, they recognized early on that this was an ideal which was not practical in everyday life and viewed private property as a necessary evil resulting from the fall of man. American theologian Robert Grant noted that, while almost all of the Church Fathers condemn the love of money for its own sake and insist upon the positive duty of almsgiving, none of them seems to have advocated the general application of Jesus' counsel to the rich young man, viz., to give away all of his worldly possessions in order to follow him. Augustine urged Christians to turn away from the desire for material wealth and success. He argued that the accumulation of wealth was not a worthy goal for Christians. Clement of Alexandria counseled that property be used for the good of the community. He sanctioned private ownership of property and the accumulation of wealth. Lactantius wrote that the ownership of property contains the material of both vices and virtues, but communism contains nothing but license for vice.